Hi, everyone. Like Shannon said, I'm Chris Ratliff, presenting on technical interviewing. I'm a senior software engineer at Google. I work in a group called InProd, which is really short for engineering productivity. We're often focused on how to make developers work better, faster, make products more reliable. I'm based in Lexington, Kentucky. I grew up in Pikeville and moved to Lexington around high school. Went to UK and worked at a number of local companies like Smart, Big Ass Fans, Badger Technologies, a couple of startups before starting to work in bigger tech companies like Meta and Facebook or Google. So a little bit of background, technical interviewing, there's a lot of content and there's a lot you could study for. So instead of maybe going really deep into that, I'm hoping to give a bit of a broad overview and say, these are things that'll be useful to look into because it does require study on your own and there's no way I could cover everything here. So I'm hoping to give just enough to be a good starting point, but feel free to ask any questions if there's something you want to know more about. Let's see, get the slides up. So first, just give a few encouragements. I am going to focus on sort of the big tech style interviews, the more difficult ones, Google, Meta, a number of other companies. And I wanted to give the encouragement for, at least for myself, when I studied for those interviews. When I was interviewing in other places, the interviews often were kind of much easier. So if this seems like a lot, if I go through part of it and you're like, I don't know anything about Big O or dynamic programming, it's probably fine. Just kind of say, here's what you can study for. So if you only get half of it, you're probably still going to be able to find a job with that. And just to say that too, I've failed many interviews and just make sure to learn for them. I've failed some where I just let the interviewer kind of talk for a very long time. And then when we got to the coding portion, I had like 10 minutes left. And it was actually a fairly simple problem. I just didn't have enough time. And you learn, even in those failures, you learn like, oh man, I really should have, when the interviewer said like, if this is distraction, don't let me bother you, I probably should have pushed like, no, let's get to this afterwards. Just from knowing the format. If you have a question, you don't know how you do it, how it should be done, look it up when you get home. You can only get better. At least for myself, when I first interviewed for Google, I didn't think I'd actually get an offer. I just hoped that I'd learn what I needed to do for next time so I can be better. So that's just to set that up. There's a link. I'll share the slides with Shannon because I have a lot of links, especially at the end. I like reading Steve Yeage's blog when it was very active. So just the encouragement he wrote to get that job at Google, very similar, just these sort of, even if you don't get a job offer, if you don't end up where you want, just really try to look for challenge and opportunities to see what you can learn from them or where you can go. Then let's see. So here's a quick list of types of interviews. Things that you might run into in interviews, even if they aren't all a full interview out of itself. They're very often be mixed. Coding around system design, behavioral, airport beer interviews, that might sound funny, but I once interviewed at a company that I got a job offer from and worked at for a couple of years. The interview was, I got lunch with someone at Panera Bread. I got a beer with someone at Mirror Twin and dessert with someone at Ted's Montana Grill. That was my interview. I got a job. No coding rounds. You know, hopefully we can all be that lucky. But you know, so there are many different types of interviews. Some people swear that they will never do a take-home interview. They're kind of like, yeah, they can pay me if they want. My encouragement is to not really have a negative attitude around the type of interview. Some people swear they will never do a leak code or coding interviews. You know, algorithms or data structures interview. I really personally feel like you know, some people say this type of interview is bad. I really feel like it's more the interview will filter for what the company wants, and that might not be what you are. You know, I know for myself, like I'm actually very much a generalist. If someone is looking for very specific domain knowledge, I'm, you know, probably not getting the job. I've worked in embedded systems, I've worked in web, I've worked in infrastructure, interprod, testing, QA, all for like a couple of years. So if someone like really says, you know, we need someone who can like know this very deeply, hit the ground running, not take time to learn anything, that's probably not a job I'm getting. I feel like, you know, I work with Google. I feel like that is a good fit for me because they're kind of the opposite. They're like, we don't care if you know this language, this framework, this whatever. We care that you are smart and can learn. So, yeah, like I said, my opinion, the interview might not be the style you like, but it's really better to understand that like this is what the company is looking for, and kind of do your best knowing that. Like I said, at the list, there's probably many more because I know that there's a lot of people who talk about interviewing and do different things. So I'd be surprised if this list is complete. So like I said, I am going to focus on the big tech or Google style interviews. Those typically consist of a behavioral interview, several coding rounds, and system design. I think you guys would just be likely starting your career. It's very, very rare to see a system design interview for a new grad. Even for a mid-level employee, don't you typically start to see those until you're senior. So I don't focus on them as much in this presentation, but I do have links at the end if you're interested in what those look like. One really big thing is interviewing is a skill. Like I said earlier, if you can fail in an interview, but the most important thing to learn is learn from it. And any other skill, deliberate practice. So making sure you have a system of study. So, and that's really what I want to focus on here is like how to go about getting better, how to go about studying for them. Because even just doing a bunch, like, isn't always helpful if you aren't reflective. How can I improve? What can I do better? Or have a system to study. Even people who sign up for Lead Code, do 200 questions, if they just do 200 easies or 200 of the same breadth first search problem, they aren't going to get better because they're not kind of expanding their knowledge. They're just practicing what they already know. So something else, interviewers often have an established criteria and the results are based on this criteria as much as possible. This is a really big one for big textiles. Like I said in earlier, where I got a job based purely off of lunches and drinks, that is very much not the case in big tech interviews. They can write some notes to say like, hey, this person was just awful, but if you curse them out or something, like there's no, I'm not talking like just, or maybe grumpy, but like if you were just really not someone they can be around. But generally the results are, how do they do problem solving? How is their coding? That are very criteria based. So like that's part of why these interviews are focused on this presentation, because they actually are something that you can decidedly get better on instead of just going to maybe a startup where like, you know, they just want someone they like and that may or may not be you. And there's not really a way to like get better at I worked at a place once where everyone did CrossFit. If you weren't doing CrossFit, like you were kind of on the outs. You can't know to do CrossFit before you get in the interview. But with big tech style interviews, there's criteria. You can learn how to get better at that. So that's one of the reasons I focus on it here. So to get into that, here's a little interview strategy. The top is a little bit of what I'm calling a naive approach, where someone welcomes you. That takes some time. They ask the question, solve it by talking it through, then you code it, maybe a time for questions at the end. And then at the bottom, it's kind of what I'm calling practiced. The extra time is not literally like go home, you're over, but just to say if you optimize it, that time can be spent maybe where it's needed rather than just kind of throughout the interview. So some small tips are the majority of your time should be spent problem solving in these types of interviews. If you're getting a hard problem, you want to be able to have time to think through it, think through the edge cases, think through ways to test it. Be prepared to start the interview in the welcome. This might actually sound funny, but like, you know you're going to have a hard time problem. The interviewer is going to try to put you at ease, try to ask, hey, do you need a drink? Do you need this? Like, you should kind of know you're going to get that question. And you should be prepared with a drink, be prepared with like not needing extra time. They're supposed to put you at ease. If you're already at ease, you can spend half the time letting that happen. So just some tips: rehearse behavioral questions. You can look up lists. You can write, add your own as you've given answers. I think that there's slides on a lot of these at the end. So this is just kind of very topic. But the biggest one is basic algorithms should almost be done by memory. If you get a question that's depth first search, breadth first search, or like you need to make a linked list, whatever your language of choice is, you should not be figuring that out in the interview. It should just be something that you have already done. Let's see. Sorry. So behavioral tips. So as I already said, being comfortable, ready to start the interviews, way to save time. I've been guilty of this myself without rehearsing questions with star mesh. Is like someone asked me a question, what was the time you had conflict with a team member or co-mate? I'm just like, I just end up sitting there like, oh man, when did I have a conflict? Well, that was a conflict that was not good to share. So you end up just wasting maybe a couple minutes thinking about something that you probably could have been prepared for. Ideally you have a lot of interviews lined up and you can practice this kind of naturally, but it's also just good to have all of these written out beforehand. When was a time that you worked through a disagreement with a manager? So that way, when you're asked a question or a similar question, you kind of already have that story top of mind. It's something that you're not going to have to sit and think about, because at the end of the day, if they have a criteria, you need to hit every point, or if they have a coding problem, that time would be much better spent thinking like through how do I solve this complex coding problem than remembering the time you had a conflict with a teammate that you probably could have written out beforehand. And then one, like I said, is drive the conversation. This might be one that takes some practice and confidence to get used to. I know I definitely didn't have it at first, but I've had interviewers who were awkward. They were nervous, just interacting with someone they didn't know. And it can be really weird as the interviewee, just kind of like having to flip the script and be the one putting them at ease, or just show like, no, I'm friendly. I'm not going to like, this is going to go great. But even just kind of being able to read the room and drive the conversation yourself can be really valuable in saving time, because you're wanting to get to the same point they are of, you getting through a coding question and solving and answering it. So kind of the quicker you can drive that yourself, the better off you are. So this is then kind of the crux of it, where I said you should spend most of your time is solving the problem. It's also depending on the company, the one you can probably not prepare for the most. Some companies, they try to put people under NDA, and if they find them externally linked, they don't ask them. But you memorize and learn the tools, a lot of the algorithms and data structures that they're often built on. So making sure you understand the prompt, checking for edge cases. Second point is, I think, really important, is many interviewers are fine with you coding a problem while working on it. I don't advise that personally. It's kind of I don't know if you've gone through your program doing things in pseudocode. You almost want to do that during your interview, because once you start writing out that code and then you realize, oh wait, this isn't going to work. What I would do is figure out, okay, how much of my code is salvageable? How much do I need to delete? How much do I need to rework? And you're kind of like not dealing with a blank slate. So it can often be much better, even if the interviewer says, go ahead and get started, making sure you have it fully worked out in your mind. This might be surprising to hear, but especially at like the really difficult places to interview, that have difficult interviews, the interviewers actually, have a lot of interviews that don't go great. They, sit through 10 and like maybe 7 of them are not good experiences. Typically if the interviewee is not having a good time, neither is the interviewer. Because like if the interviewee feels bad, the interviewer is like, oh man, this is not fun for him. They're having fun either. Usually the interviewer is, at least on some degree, like cheering for you. They'd rather have a good time interviewing you, working through a problem with you, than like trying to figure out how to get someone unstuck or do something like that. So talk through it with them. 1 or 2 hints is okay. The smart way to do it is maybe not to like ask for a hint, but just talk the problem out loud. Ask rhetorical questions to yourself, not, man, I don't know what to do here, but say, can I do this, or would this work? And you'll often get very quick, like, yeah, that approach will work, but there might be something better. So as much as you can, be upfront with your problem solving, whether that's pseudocode, whether that's talking it out before you actually begin to code. Then, like I've said, if you've practiced interview coding, I did this myself in my interview at Google. It took me 40 minutes to solve a problem or to figure out what I was going to do. And then I had to code it in, probably about 5. I actually didn't even think I told the interviewer, I was like, I don't think I have time to code this. And he actually pushed me. He was like, no, you got it. And I was able to write out the whole solution in, about 5 minutes. And that's really, I think, in some ways, the ideal situation for your interview. Once you know the solution, the code should come out fluidly enough to where you can just write it out. And that's in some ways similar to work. Coding is often the smaller part to planning and designing and working through what you want to do. This slide, there's way too much to go through each one in depth, but the mastering data structures and algorithms is an absolute must for these types of interviews. Almost all the problems you see are going to involve something on this list. If you apply to different specific companies, researching them as much beforehand can be really useful. It's well known that some companies, ask a lot of graph questions. It's well known that some companies ask more dynamic programming. Studying who the company you're interviewing at can be really useful. But even then, if you're interviewing with sort of big textile companies, knowing all of these is these are sort of all the basics. They're much more specialized and very particular algorithms that like might only be useful in a certain situation. But these ones are sort of the bread and butter ones that anyone should know for interviewing, I think. So quick thing on big O notation. I don't know how much you cover this in your courses, but for the big text style interviews, this is something you're going to have to be kind of talking about as you go through your solution. You should be able to say how long every portion of your design takes. And you need to be able to know every portion because your time complexity is going to be the most complex part of your solution. So, you know that most of your searching can be log in if it's binary, sorting can be in log in. And then often as you combine those, or if you have, say, maybe something with array manipulation, could be even more. Yeah. So this is something that you can honestly study for a long time, and it's even in college courses, it's something that like I've seen a lot of people struggle with. But exposure, repetition really helps. So this is something I'll say too. Language selection can be very important in the coding portions. I intentionally, even though I've worked in C and C++ when working in embedded systems, knew I would want to do all of my coding interviews in Python. This is just a quick example of implementing a quick sort in C++ versus Python is technically temp sort, but it's still in login. And if I have a coding interview, I know which one of these two I'm wanting to write. One has a lot fewer opportunities for mistakes. I'm sure you guys have been learning yourselves. One flipped greater than less and then extra plus sign somewhere. You'll figure it out, but on a time test is not the place to do it. Let's see. As I mentioned before, basic algorithms should be something, even if there isn't a library for in your language, you should know pretty well. The depth first search, breadth first search in Python, even though there isn't a really good tree or graph library, you can usually implement in about 5 lines of code. So when you have a problem that even if the graphing problem was hard to figure out what you want to do, once you've determined what I want to do is a breadth first search for an element, once you've determined that's what you want to do, coding it should be very straightforward. And that's the sort of practice that I think you want to get to. Let's see. This slide is a bunch of resources that I've thought have been really helpful for me. Let's see. Some of the things here are pretty well known. Leak code, neat code, different ways for learning that data structures and algorithms. At least for me, Cracking the Coding Interview was a very useful book, even though Leak Code has probably replaced the bulk of that book with a much more comprehensive way to study data structures and algorithms. The interview format section, the knowledge of what people were looking for from my resume or how to present in interviews is only the very beginning of that book, but I found it to be very helpful. Grokking the Modern System Design Interview, that's the one I mentioned earlier, where you're unlikely to see those in an early career, even mid-level interview, but if you're interested in learning more of what those are about, it can be a very informal one. The first link, How to Solve a Google Coding Interview Question, is actually a YouTube video of a couple engineers going through the process of an interview. So if you haven't seen that before, or if that's what you were hoping I was going to do, sorry if you were, but there's a link to that. It's a bit more of a basic question, but it lets you see the style, how to solve it, what they're looking for, and things like that. And at the bottom is what I found to be a very useful blog post on salary negotiation. I think I'll say that just having read that, the confidence it gave me to actually negotiate a salary has definitely like given, benefited me financially a lot. I know a lot of people who maybe they get their first job in tech, they're so excited, they don't feel they can negotiate, or it's not something they realize they can do in general. It's a good post just to kind of get some information on that. Anyways, that is all the slides I had. But I'm happy to take any questions, go more in depth into anything, or anything that anyone has.
That was awesome. Thanks, Chris. Can you just talk a little bit about, I guess, like how you prepared for your first tech interview and maybe how that's different than how you prepared now?
Yeah. My first tech interview, I would say I didn't prepare. I knew there would be a coding portion, and I was just super worried about it, but I didn't know what to actually prepare for. And I think this knowledge is a lot more common now than it used to be back then. And one of the reasons I was hoping to speak on this is that I know from personal experience, like when you look at what I heard about people experiencing that, say, Stanford, where people, as they got job offers, they shared it with all the other students. So the other students would know, this is the type of money you can expect. This is the type of offer this company gives. Nothing like that existed even at UK. Stanford was probably also the first place to have like an interview club where people would share those types of questions and know how to study for. And that's been, I'd say, democratized now with things like levels.fyi or LeetCode, which did not exist when I first started studying. I think Cracking the Coding interview probably wasn't even published for the first time I did a tech interview. The last time I studied for an interview, I probably did maybe 120 LeetCode questions. And at least for me, the way I did that was once a day, I try to do 1 or 2 questions. I was working a full-time job, so I wasn't able just to maybe blitz through it like some college students have been able to. 120 maybe for Google is actually a bit lower than what other people would say they had to study. I think you see some people say 200 to 250. The goal of that, I think, is, like I said earlier, you want to make sure that you don't do 30 of the same question. You want to make sure that you're getting a very broad representative of those different algorithms that you're learning them. And that at the time, YouTube videos were probably the best for system design. Watching a lot of YouTube videos on people doing mock interviews, on people doing, especially for system design, there's a couple, like I think grokking resources for system design, but it's actually much harder to find resources for that. And as I mentioned, for behavioral, I wrote out examples for a lot of the questions. I wrote out like the time that I had. The manager said, no, we need to ship this without your feature. I disagreed and compiled data to make my case more stronger. I didn't just, yell at them or shut down, but the time that I had a conflict with, have those stories written down. That was the other thing I did to prepare for behavioral. Does that answer anything else?
Yeah, I think even so I've been tangentially in the tech realm for about a decade now, from my experience with CodeU. And I think, yeah, you kind of nailed it with how it's changed so much and there are just so many resources now, which is really great. Stephanie had a question in the chat. She was wondering how she can get some like a guideline on what to ask for salary wise. She said that she knows she needs to negotiate, but she's had trouble with interviews in the past about knowing what to ask for.
Yeah. So I can put this in the chat. This is a link to levels.fyi. So the first thing when you look at this website, almost everything there is the Bay Area and Seattle. So don't maybe freak out. But if you go through the site, you can look for by city. So Lexington and Louisville have not a ton, but they have enough to maybe get you an idea of what other software developers are making. Part of the difficulty in answering this question is like the best I can do is just give you a bunch of data because it can vary so much by region, company, level that it's really hard to give an answer other than to say like, I know I have worked with developers that make $40,000 and I've worked with developers that make $800,000 and everywhere in between. So there's a super broad range. And I think, having to look through the data and figuring out where you're at is probably the best you can do.
Yeah, I'll just add, we talk about this a lot in our workshops as well. And as much as possible, we try to collect salary data from our students. We usually, once they get jobs. So we've seen the average starting salary tends to be between about 50 to 55,000, but that it goes up pretty quickly from there. So whether it's somebody leaving and going to a different company for that second job, or getting like a raise or promotion after they've been there for a little bit, has kind of been pretty consistent, I would say, since I started, that's what we've seen. So we try to share that information and we try to gather it as much as possible so that we can share with you all kind of the latest and greatest, because I know it's tough even when you have these resources. Yeah,
that's really great. When I went to college, I asked them as I was leaving, hey, you asked me the survey, what's my offer when I'm leaving, but I asked, what are the results? And they're like, no, we don't share that. I'm like, why not?
Yeah, that's frustrating. Yeah, we definitely want you all to feel prepared and to have the information. Chris, I know you talked a lot about the different styles of interviewing, and how, it may just be like even a conversation in a restaurant type of deal, and how it can vary like company to company. What are, I guess, if you were interviewing somebody for like more of a junior level role, what do you think would be the typical styles that you might see?
So like I said, for if you're applying to a bigger tech company, the format's pretty universal. It's going to be something like a behavioral round and then 3-ish coding rounds. And I think a lot of smaller companies look at what bigger companies do and try to copy that. So I think lead code has just become more and more common. There are still companies that, you're running people that just absolutely hate that as well. So I'd say second to that, and this is maybe a bit more local, what I've seen in more local interviews is almost the resume review style, where they'll go over your resume and hope to see that you just know what you said you know. Because there's some benefits to that interview style as well. Some people say they're an expert in .NET, but then when you just say, so how did you implement this? What's, what is a namespace in .NET? Like, some people fall apart after, writing that on their interviews or their resume. So that's actually a fairly common one as well. And then I think they just hope to sort of dig into like, what's the project you've done? What tools did you use on it? To see that like you're technical, you know what you say you know, and are somewhat trustworthy then. I had take-home projects, but not too many. There's, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Maybe-
that's really like what we've heard. Is kind of like the take-home assignments, and it seems, especially with a lot of companies being remote now, that either a take-home assignment or like a live coding, but it may not be, the interviewer may or may not be in there with you. They might just kind of give you a project to work on for a little bit and then come in and check on you. Is kind of what we've heard for those.
Yeah. Like I said, I think a lot of things can take practice. I actually will admit, you know, I've had job offers from a number of top companies, but for whatever reason, if you give me like the same lead code test without an interviewer, I do significantly worse. So some of it can just be figuring out what interview style works for you, hoping to see, finding what companies do that style of interview, because maybe, the live coding is not your thing. You can still be a great developer, and you can still, find companies who just also hate live coding.
Very true. And you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions, or we'll go ahead and wrap up? All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And I think you said you'd share your slides. So I'll get those in Slack later this week. I'm out tomorrow and Wednesday. So it'll probably be Thursday when I share those. But thank you all for attending. We appreciate you all coming out, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.